Hello, Americans. I'm Paul Harvey. From our earliest recollections as children to our most recent as parents, 5 of the happiest, warmest words in the English language are these. Daddy, tell me a story. Today, together, you and I are going to learn the rest of the story. Now, the fact that Napoleon was in the bathtub a lot is well known to his biographers and to students of his era. He had both an arthritic condition and a nervous condition, a tendency which encouraged the habit. But until the private papers of his brother Joseph were published, nobody ever really knew the rest of the story. Once upon a Napoleonic time, he was taking a bath in the Tuileries in France. Something happened to the little roly-poly emperor in that soapy-scented tub, which changed the map of the world. Napoleon Bonaparte's immersed in suds. Brothers Joseph and Lucien standing beside the tub, which was a raised marble island in the room, about 3 small steps up from the floor. It was not at all unusual for Napoleon to conduct urgent business in his bathroom. He spent so much time soaking and splashing around in there that it was almost imperative, so his brothers were present by invitation. Napoleon wanted their advice. He didn't really want their advice. He wanted them to agree with him, is what he did. Thousands of miles away, our Thomas Jefferson was anxiously awaiting the emperor's decision. And here in his bubbly bath, Napoleon was asking the concurrence of his advisors. He had already made up his mind to a deal. His brother Joseph recalls that Napoleon said, "I've made up my mind to sell." It was Joseph who exclaimed, "Nonsense." He said, "You can't do that. It's been just a few weeks since Spain ceded it back to us." And Lucien, the other brother, was silent, but he knew when Napoleon, inflexibly stubborn, was going to stand his ground, and this was one of those times. As Joseph became more disturbed, however, Lucien did timidly volunteer the suggestion that the chambers might not give consent. At this point, Napoleon waved to his valet to bring the towels, and with finality he said, "Gentlemen, I don't care a fig for your opinions. If England declares war on us, we'll never be able to defend those isolated swamps and forests. So the sale will go through with or without your consent, without the consent of anybody at all. Is that clear?" Well, Joe got angry. Joseph stalked up to the steaming tub and he bent over his brother and he said, "Now, you listen to me. If you try this, I'm going to oppose you in the Senate. I'm going to defeat your fantastic scheme, however long it takes." Strong talk. The soothing effects of the warm tub have been lost now. Napoleon is livid with rage now, and he gripped the sides of the tub, and he pulled himself almost upright, and he said, "Why, you insolent!" It was at this point that it happened. The great man's foot slipped. He's holding one side of the tub with one hand, he's gesturing with the other, and his foot slipped. And the mighty Napoleon, conqueror of a third of the world, landed with a loud splash in the soapy water, and waves of the perfumed liquid sloshed out of the tub, all over Joseph and his clothes and his face. And watching the flood, Napoleon forgot his own discomfiture. He forgot his outburst of anger. He started to chuckle as Joseph sputtered in speechless fury, mopping at his eyes, turning to blot the limp ruffles of his shirt and his brocaded vest. Joseph, caught sight of himself in one of the many gilt mirrors, and he smiled, and that smile grew into a grin, and the grin burst into a laugh, and timid Lucien laughed, and soon the 3 brothers are laughing uncontrollably as Napoleon splashed again and again, more and more of the soapy, smelly water all over his brothers, even as they had played as boys so many lost forever years before. And when the circus subsided and the anger was gone, the opposition was spent, never to be revived. Let me say that Napoleon was a fantastically clever man. He was actually the least of the 3 brothers physically, and yet his uncanny cunning made him their leader and the dictator of a third of the known world. No, I am not saying that he slipped in the bathtub on purpose. In his later letters, brother Joseph does not hint that this might have been anything but an accident. What I am saying is that whether it was intentional or accidental, because the mighty Napoleon slipped in a bathtub and soapy water drenched the fires of opposition, they closed the deal, accepted $15 million, They sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States. And now you know the rest of the story. Mrs. Paul, she's the choir director for the West Side Baptist Church in Beatrice, Nebraska. Her daughter Marilyn is the church pianist. Neither has ever been late for choir practice. On the contrary, both are in the habit of arriving maybe 15 minutes early. Now it's Wednesday evening. It's March 1, 1950 at 7 o'clock. Choir practice begins at 7:30. Mrs. Paul calls to her daughter upstairs that they should be leaving now. It's almost time, but there's no answer. Mrs. Paul returns to her last-minute preparation. The minutes are ticking away. It's now 7:15 when she realizes that her daughter is asleep. So Mrs. Paul goes upstairs. She awakens her daughter. There's time only to tidy up and start out. This is going to be the first time that either Mrs. Paul or her daughter Marilyn has ever been late for choir practice. Their perfect attendance record is finally broken. But you know what? There are 18 members, 18, in the West Side Baptist Church Choir. Everyone that very same night was late for choir practice. And all 18 had perfectly valid excuses, and all are late. Now, you've heard the excuse of Mrs. Paul, the choir director, her daughter Marilyn, the church pianist. They had fallen asleep after dinner, didn't awaken in time. The others also had excuses. LaDonna Vandergrift, a high school sophomore, was having trouble with her homework, and like Mrs. Paul and her daughter, Miss Vandergrift began practice promptly as a rule. Always came early, as a fact, but this evening she was detained by a particularly baffling geometry problem. Royina Estes and her sister Sadie, they're ready to leave their house on time, but their car wouldn't start. The two sisters called Miss Vandergrift, asked her to pick them up. Miss Vandergrift was working on her geometry, remember, and the Estes sisters had to wait. Ordinarily, Miss Schuster, she was about 10 minutes early for choir practice. The night of March 1, she was detained at her mother's house. The two were preparing for a later missionary meeting. Herb Kipf was at his own home, could easily have been early, but there was this important letter that he had to write. He'd been putting it off for some time. Time just got away from him. Excuses, excuses, excuses. Joyce Black. Probably she would have been early. Certainly she would have been on time. But it was just so cold that evening that she waited to stay in the house until the last possible minute, and she waited too many minutes and she was late. Harvey Ahi, he would have been on time, but his wife was out of town. That left him in charge of their two young sons. A friend had invited Harvey and the two out to a pleasant dinner. A pleasant conversation carried them away, and Harvey was late. Lucille Jones and Dorothy Voron, both high school girls, lived next door to each other. Lucille was listening to a half-hour radio program that began at 7 o'clock. She just had to hear how it ended. Dorothy waited for her pastor Klemple and his wife. They were always on time for choir practice, but not on the evening of March 1. Pastor Klemple's wristwatch, the accuracy of which always made him so proud, that night it was 5 minutes slow. The remaining choir members had equally valid excuses for their tardiness. Excuses, 18 in all. Never before and never since had each and every choir member of the West Side Baptist Church been late for choir practice on the same evening. Never before. That was Wednesday, March 1, 1950. Choir practice scheduled as usual for 7:30 p.m. But nobody had showed up at 7:30. 7:30 p.m. That was the time when a natural gas leak surfacing in the basement of the West Side Baptist Church was ignited by the furnace, and the whole church blew up. It was demolished. In fact, the old furnace of the West Side Baptist Church was directly below the choir loft. Now you know the rest of the story. If you grew up on a diet of cow country music and hillbilly ballads, then you're familiar with the name Lonzo Green. Great country singer, But he was a stranger in town that summer. He'd brought his wife and a couple of youngsters all the way from Cherry Valley, Arkansas to visit relatives in Tennessee. But as I say, he was a stranger in town. He was unaccustomed to the local customs and to the local taboos. So Lonzo was a little surprised to learn that a friend of his young nephew, under no circumstances, was to be allowed into the house. His teenage nephew Jimmy had proudly, excitedly spread the word around school that Uncle Lonzo, the musician, had come to town and he was staying with them right there in their apartment on Lauderdale Court. And naturally, this impressed Jimmy's young friends, especially one, that quiet, dark-haired boy of 15. Jimmy came home that day. He told Lonzo about the boy, how he had his own guitar, but he didn't know how to tune it. And if Lonzo would just tune the guitar for him, the boy would be so grateful. Lonzo said he'd be happy to oblige. He asked Jimmy when his friend could come with his guitar, and then Jimmy's eager smile faded. His friend could come by that afternoon, but Mom and Dad had made a firm rule that the boy was not to be allowed inside. He was, as they said in those days, from the wrong side of the tracks. They had explained, well, some folks called him white trash. Maybe he could meet Lonzo outside, but he was not permitted in the house. Lonzo did not quite understand, but he nodded. He said nothing. A couple of hours later, he walked out into the sunlight and waited, and in a minute or two, the figure appeared at the end of the lane, a boy with a dark hair and a battered guitar slung across his back. And as the boy walked closer, Lonzo studied the sensitive features, the timid sidewise glances at this better neighborhood. The sting of self-consciousness was apparent. Then he noticed that the boy's guitar, obviously inexpensive, doubtless secondhand, was tethered by a piece of string. Well, they met at the curb. They shook hands. The youngster gave a shy, slight smile, and there at the curbside they sat down, right on the curb. And Lonzo took the instrument from the boy. Nobody had ever shown him how to tune his guitar, ever. With a soft, polite southern drawl, the lad said, "No, sir, nobody ever did." And then Lonzo demonstrated. He placed his fingers in the proper frets, and the boy watched intently, and after the guitar was tuned, he thanked Lonzo. He began to get up from the curb, but Lonzo would not let him leave. For he, Lonzo, had tasted poverty back in Arkansas in his own youth. And he had known the other side of the neighborhood barrier, which separated acceptable from unacceptable people. How such a little kindness from the right person would have meant back then. So Lonzo asked this dark-haired boy to stay a little while longer, and the hesitant smile now broke into a broad grin. And with the little lad's inexpensive guitar, Lonzo played and sang one familiar hill country ballad after another, and shortly the haunting reticence in the boy's eyes was gone, replaced by the joy of the music. Cars were streaming past them. The shadows of late afternoon grew long. After Lonzo had taught the boy to play a few chords on the guitar, the youngster thanked him again and was on his way. He was not invited inside. Not then. Lonzo Green would never meet him again. But the boy had left his company with a warm memory, a memory that he would carry throughout his remarkable, radical change in his own life, because someday you would invite that dark-haired boy from the wrong side of town into your home. And when he crossed those tracks for good, he brought with him his guitar, and he brought the soft, polite drawl and the hesitant smile. That was many summers, 33 motion pictures, millions of records, and a lifetime ago. And if there is a happy ending mixed in with our own bittersweet memories, it is that the boy was never, ever after unwelcome again. That young fellow who once upon a time was not allowed inside was Elvis Presley. Now you know the rest of the story. It was late at night, and yet at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue there was one light in an upstairs window in the room where President Harry Truman sat sleepless and pondering. No other United States president had ever faced a decision quite like this one: to bomb or not to bomb That was the question. At that time, no other nation on planet Earth had the big bomb. Just to threaten its use should be decisive, but to be convincing, if he said it, he'd have to mean it. And this was the consideration tormenting President Truman through that long night. Back off, the free world was in jeopardy. Rush forward, history might remember him as a madman. So here is our president ransacking his mind, searching his soul, wondering at the millions of deaths and the far-reaching ramifications should he decide to invoke the atom bomb. If his decision were yes, was the technology there? There's no question about that. The bomb had been demonstrated viable by the dawn's early light, July 16, 1945, near Alamogordo Air Base, 20 miles south of Albuquerque. One such had been detonated. It had been cradled atop a steel tower surrounded by scientific equipment and fearfully observed from 5.5 miles away. The brilliant flash of light made mountains 10 miles distant glow, as then and there was unleashed more destructive energy by 400 million times than anything ever before. The mushroom cloud reached 7.5 miles into the sky. The steel tower, which had held the bomb, had vaporized, and the desert floor was fused into a miles-wide crust of glass. This was the awesome instrument of destruction that was President Truman's to use or to refuse, and now he must make up his mind. Should he pull the trigger? And that night, the agonizing contemplation brought forth the decision, and the following day, a certain ambassador was summoned to the White House. Senator Henry Jackson, chairman of Senate Armed Services, was present as a witness. When President Truman told the ambassador, "We're going to drop it on you. We're going to drop it on you." This time, the president did not drop the bomb. This time, he didn't have to. Oh, no. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they had already been obliterated in August of 1945, a full year previous. So this new adversary knew that our country, our president, meant business and quickly complied with President Truman's demand to get their troops out of Iran within 48 hours, he said. Indeed, they were out within 24 hours. After Ambassador Andrei Gromyko relayed word that this was not a bluff, that Harry Truman was quite prepared and willing to make a wasteland out of Moscow. Now you know the rest of the story. When Raymond Floyd was one of the hottest young players on the professional golf tour, he loved off-the-tour, big-money gambling games, even more than professional matches. Friends in Dallas would arrange high-stakes shootouts with amateurs, always handicapping himself in some way to even things out. But then one day, some Texas gamblers got together, and they proposed a no-handicap game to Ray Floyd. They told him that he could play this non-touring pro toe-to-toe. Some fell out in the boondocks. Ray's hometown Tennyson Park crowd would be able to bet all of their money. Ray said, okay. Now, the course where this massive currency exchange was to take place was called Horizon Hills. Ray Floyd had no idea what to expect. When he drove up to Horizon Hills, he was met by a man in a motorized golf cart. The man was a few years older than Ray. He was polite and quiet. Took Ray's big pro golf bag to the clubhouse. He carried it into the locker room, said, "May I clean your shoes?" And Ray nodded. And by the way, asked Ray, "Who is this guy I'm supposed to play?" And the man said, "I am." Ray's incredulous. "You? What do you do?" And the fellow explained that Horizon Hills was not one of those big clubs. He had been hired there a while back as a handyman, $30 a week. Now, he was sort of a combination of everything, cart man and shoe man, and clubhouse man. Well, Ray Floyd shook his head, trying to suppress a smile. He'd have something to eat, he said, and they could tee off at 1. In the interim, one of Ray's hosts asked if he'd like to take a look at the course. Ray said, "What for? I'm playing the Shoeshine Boy." But one question lingered in the visiting pro's mind. Rich gamblers from Dallas would be betting on him, but who on earth would be betting on this other fellow? The answer was local cotton farmers. They loved to wager. They threw C-notes around like candy wrappers at harvest time. They liked this cart man from Horizon Hills. At 1 o'clock, these same farmers piled into their beer-laden pickup trucks. They converged at the first tee. Never one to pass up a sure thing, Ray bet a ton on himself. The game is underway. Well, I'll tell you, that was quite a sight. Here are these two golfers battling it out under the Texas sun, the famous pro and the local nobody, pursued by a raucous throng of pickup trucks rumbling down the sides of the fairway. As he might have predicted, Tour pro Ray Floyd shot a blazing 67 that afternoon. 4 under par. His competitor, the cart man, shoeshine man, clubhouse man, shot a 65. He beat the wide-eyed, drop-jawed young star of the professional golf tour by a comfortable 2 strokes. Ray wanted to play another 9, but his victorious opponent had other duties. He had to put the carts up and clean the members' clubs and brush and polish their shoes. As the man walked off into the bag room, Ray Floyd stood there scratching his head. He was wondering how long it would take for fame to catch up with an anonymous, tremendously talented 20-odd-year-old shoeshine boy named Lee Trevino. Of course, you know, but then you know the rest of the story. He once referred to himself as a faunal, F-A-U-N-A-L, faunal naturalist, a man who vastly prefers a camera to a gun. Now, a lot of hunters called him oversensitive, but he in turn called the ordinary sportsman a vigorous, unintelligent butcher. He said the stuffed head of a butchered beast represents the owner's money rather than his prowess. He said such trophies make the owner look absurd. He scorned the wearing of elk's teeth on watch chains, and he condemned the killing of birds to decorate women's hats. He once had a friend whose profession it was to kill bear and mountain sheep for their pelts. He called his friend, his own friend, a ruthless butcher of defenseless animals. He called him cowardly and contemptible and wicked. He said that what his friend was doing would someday be considered a criminal act when people have awakened to the facts, he said. And then after he'd thoroughly denigrated and humiliated his professional fur hunter friend, he offered any amount of money that it would take to set him up in another line of work. An avid conservationist, he was always quoting other conservationists. He was preaching, for example, that the destruction of forests and of forest life ranked among the first of forbidden sins. I guess you'd call him a bleeding heart, though for that quality, he has long since been forgotten. There is something for which you will remember him, a gentle legacy, which has since turned the lives of children everywhere to a new appreciation of wildlife? Maybe. You see, he'd been a career military officer. He was not unaccustomed to killing. In fact, November of 1902, he was on a hunting expedition in the deep woods of Mississippi, and it was late in the afternoon. The party had pitched camp. A companion went for a walk in the woods, and there, whining piteously by the stump of a tree, was a bear cub, which apparently had become separated from its mother. Well, somebody in the hunting party roped the young bear, led him resisting into the camp. He said, "I've found a bear for y'all to shoot." Well, the ex-Army colonel, he froze with revulsion. It was in that instant, and he later said all at once, that the insanity of killing and the blindness of those who would kill struck him like a thunderbolt. And through clenched teeth he responded, no, he certainly would not shoot that bear cub. And the subsequent dressing down that he addressed to his companion made sufficient noise to be heard all the way to the next day's newspapers. I said all the way to the next day's newspapers. The newsworthiness of this incident was derived from the fact that he, a man who had refused to kill a defenseless bear cub, had been well known as a crusty, virile veteran of many safaris, as a big game hunter. And you remember him as the 26th President of the United States. Yet it was that incident in the backwoods of Mississippi, one November day in 1902, which inspired toy manufacturers all over the world to honor his name, Teddy Roosevelt, and the gentle legacy he left to children everywhere. By the tender heart you never knew is the teddy bear. Now, you know the rest of the story. The war was over. Soldiers were going home. These were Americans. They were the last to be evacuated, more than 2,400 POWs on a troop vessel called the Sultana. It's now 2 o'clock in the morning. The voyage is underway, and there was an explosion. Number 3 boiler had blown, sending a blast of metal fragments through the vessel's midsection. Many soldiers and crew were killed instantly. They were the lucky ones. A raging fire swept the Sultana. Her captain, jolted awake, rushed on deck. He was greeted by steam and smoke-licking flames. Many of the bodies tossed high in the air by the explosion were even then raining down on the deck in pieces amidst the debris. Troops able to jump the rail and swim into the distant darkness had done so. Anything that floated was swarmed by the fleeing until it and those clinging to it went down. And meanwhile, strong winds swept toward the Sultana's stern. The night air was alive with the cries of the burning and the drowning. And finally, after what seemed forever, 263-foot, 1,720-ton vessel had extinguished its own hell, had slipped beneath the black waters. What I've just related was foreseeable. In fact, it was foreseen. For an officer on board had actually received a report from his own clerk that the Sultana was overaged, overcrowded, probably would never reach port. And the report was correct in all counts. The vessel was a freighter to begin with, had never been meant to carry more than 376. Yet there may have been 2,500 troops aboard that terrible April morning, and 100 civilians, and a crew of 80. The Sultana was long overdue for an inspection and a refit, anything but shipshape. But the war was over, and with the relief came carelessness, and in carelessness was consumed the Sultana. By the way, the history books, many of them, are quite wrong. They say that 1,450 died in the Sultana disaster. The official United States Customs report on the matter, the official report, sets the death count at 1,547. That's important, because that's 30 more than drowned when the Titanic went down. I said that's 30 more than drowned on the Titanic. That makes this tragedy, the one I just relived with you, perhaps the most devastating maritime disaster in all history, even though technically it wasn't a maritime disaster at all. For the Sultana was not a ship. It was a steamboat on the Mississippi River. It was transporting Union prisoners of war from Vicksburg. She blew up, caught fire, went down 2 hours north of Memphis in the early morning of April 27, 1865. But hardly anybody noticed, because just the day before, John Wilkes Booth, Lincoln's assassin, was himself shot and killed. And that's what folks were reading about, and that's what folks were talking about. Over the years since, the Mississippi has changed course, is now flowing at least a mile west of where the Sultana was destroyed, which means that the Union soldiers who died with her are now sleeping somewhere beneath a field of soybeans, honored by a modest granite marker in nearby Elmwood Graveyard. Victims of the most costly maritime tragedy in history. And it all occurred little more than 100 yards from shore. Now you know the rest of the story. John Dillinger, public enemy number one. You know there's still a great deal of controversy over how and when he died. Today, you and I are going to set the record straight. In May of 1934, John Dillinger was hiding out. He had heard that many prominent gangland figures were submitting to plastic surgery, were having their faces changed and their fingerprints obliterated in order to become less recognizable, less detectable. And that prospect fascinated Dillinger. He called his lawyer. The lawyer mentioned the name of a German-born surgeon, a Dr. Lesser. Now, Lesser had practiced in Chicago for more than 30 years. He had done time in Leavenworth on a narcotics rap. Now he's out. He needs cash. But was he good, Dillinger wanted to know. Yes, Lesser was a magician with a knife. So the arrangements were made, and on the evening of May 27, 1934, John Dillinger arrived at a weather-beaten two-story shack on Chicago's north side. If all went well, public enemy number one would emerge incognito surgically permanently. Dillinger's lawyers met him at the house, explained the details. The place was owned by a former speakeasy operator, no problem there. Dr. Lesser and his assistant would arrive the next day. Flat fee, $5 grand, 1/3 to the lawyer. The operation would take place in a bedroom. Dillinger would recuperate in a back room. Dillinger nodded, satisfied that everything was running smoothly. In the morning, the doctor and his young assistant were brought to the house. Dr. Lesser was apparently confident, but the assistant, on the other hand, appeared to be pale and nervous, dissipated, maybe hungover. Well, anyway, Lesser examined Dillinger's heart. He asked if he wanted a local or a general anesthetic. Dillinger wanted a general. Specifically, surgically, what was it Dillinger wanted done? Well, the bad man explained that he wanted 3 moles and a scar removed. He wanted a depression removed from the bridge of his nose. He wanted a dimple in his chin erased, and of course his fingerprints. They had to come off altogether. And Dr. Lesser agreed. Dillinger disrobed, lay down on a cot. It was expected that in a matter of hours, the familiar face on the post office wall would be no more. Lesser went into the bathroom to wash his hands. Dillinger rested patiently as this assistant fellow I told you about fashioned a mask of toweling, and through this toweling, the ether would be administered. The gangster began to draw deep breaths, but in his nervousness, this young assistant gave too much ether too quickly. Now Dillinger's face is turning blue. The assistant started shouting, and Dr. Lesser hurried from the bathroom. Dillinger now has swallowed his tongue. Lesser grabbed a forceps. He removed the gangster's tongue from his throat. But there was no breathing, no respiration at all. John Dillinger, public enemy number one, was dead. In a shabby, rundown shack on Chicago's north side, just prior to cosmetic surgery, John Dillinger died from an overdose of ether. But the surgeon, Dr. Lesser, did not give up. Abruptly, he forced Dillinger's elbows into his chest. He began giving artificial respiration as best he knew how. Eventually, Dillinger, who had technically expired, revived. It was 25 days later, after the successful surgery, 25 days later, that John Dillinger strode from a Chicago theater with the lady in red and the FBI shot him dead. That's what history has said. But you know the rest of the story. You know that John Dillinger died twice. It is May 8 of 1936, and you are alone in the basement of Crosby's Mortuary. Crosby's Mortuary is near Burlingame, California. Well, now, wait a minute. You're not quite alone, because on a slab awaiting preparations for funeral and burial is a body with an identification tag on one of its toes. Body of a young man named Ralph Neves, N-E-V-E-S. Ralph's wearing his breeches and one boot, and that's it. It's as though he had just been dumped there quickly, carelessly. In fact, that's what had happened. Ralph Neves was an 18-year young jockey. And on the afternoon of May 8, he had been racing at Bay Meadows in San Mateo, and it happened in the 4th race, and he's running 4th. Thundering into a fast turn on the backstretch, Ralph's mount stumbled, and 5 horses came down in a jam-up. Ralph had been catapulted into the air, and when the trampling hoofs were silent and the dust had settled, there's Ralph lying face down on the track, motionless. Well, 3 doctors rushed to the scene. As thousands of spectators murmured anxiously, Jockey Nevis was pronounced dead even before the stretcher arrived. Minutes later, his body was placed in an ambulance and driven to a nearby hospital. The hospital didn't even want Ralph Nevis. "Don't waste our time," the ambulance driver was told. "Take him straight to Crosby's mortuary." Now you know how Ralph Nevis wound up in Crosby's basement with nothing on but his pants and one boot. The ambulance driver just deposited him and left. When Ralph's friend Horace Wald heard what had happened, he hurried over to the mortuary, and at first the mortician was reticent to allow Horace to see Ralph, but then Horace explained that he was a doctor and he was used to such things. Lucky for Ralph that Horace was a physician, because when Dr. Wald was taken downstairs, he gazed at Ralph Nevis for a rather long time. Then suddenly, inexplicably, he was compelled to reach out and touch the jockey's neck, just feel the carotid for a pulse. There was one. It was a faint pulse, but it was a pulse. Dr. Wald ran out to his car. He returned with his little black bag. A single shot of adrenaline brought Ralph bolt upright in the slab, and before Dr. Wald could say a word, the jockey had fled the mortuary in panic. Ralph ran 2 miles to San Mateo. He ran 2 miles. Then he hailed a cab. Still frightened and confused, he demanded, "Take me to Bay Meadows Racetrack." The driver took him to Bay Meadows, and before the cab had stopped at the curb, Ralph had jumped out, still wearing only his pants and one boot. He ran into the grandstand. Somebody cried, "There's Ralph Nevis, the dead jockey." And there were screams, and the crowd started charging him, and Ralph kept running. He didn't stop until he dropped from exhaustion. Next day, May 9. Next day, Ralph's back in the saddle, he's back on the track, and he's racing. He continued to ride until he retired 28 years later. One of the doctors who had pronounced him dead just shook his head. Decided then that it was what do you call it, a profound depression of the nervous system. That's what had made it seem that Ralph Nevis had died. The only reason I'm bringing this to your attention at all is that one of these days, you're going to be reading a roster of the Racing Hall of Famers, and you're going to see the name of Ralph Nevis. Oh, it's there, you bet. 3,772 first-place finishes. The 23rd winningest jockey of all time. And when you see that, you're going to know that in order to make that record, Ralph had to come back from the grave. Because now you know the rest of the story. The summer of 1793 was the driest and the hottest that folks in Philadelphia ever remembered. Streams were stagnant pools, and flies and mosquitoes swarmed. The dirty river stank unbearably, and the hush of houses where children were sick filled the foul streets with a torrent of silence. August 19, a doctor diagnosed it as bilious-remittent yellow fever. That was the beginning, and before it was over, the city of Philadelphia endured an agony like none that ever befell any American city before or since. For 100 days and nights of horror, 55,000 citizens cringed behind drawn curtains, weeping and praying, not daring to venture forth. Our greatest seaport was paralyzed, and our government, because in 1793, Philadelphia, of course, was the capital of the United States. Now, this was not the first siege of yellow fever for Philadelphia. Every 70 years, the plague had returned, and each time more dreadful than the last. Where other sieges of the disease had killed maybe 5 a day, this time people were dying at the rate of 17 a day, and then 20, and then 40. 3 out of every 4 afflicted died, usually within a week. Outside the town of Gray's Ferry, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson lived. Everybody who could was fleeing the town. Jefferson wrote to James Madison that he feared panic would add famine to the disease. The College of Physicians said that explosions might drive the plague away, so the governor ordered cannon discharged in the city streets all day, August 30. And others carried muskets, firing them at intervals. Anybody wearing a mourning band was avoided. Handshaking was abandoned, but nothing did any good. More people died, and the air hummed with mosquitoes. But we didn't know then about mosquitoes, because this was 100 years before Walter Reed and his victory. So the mosquitoes went unmolested while more bred in the stagnant pools, and men fired more cannons and more people died. Doctors standing midway between medieval and modern medicine had more courage than knowledge. Finally, in despair, they turned to purges and tonics and bloodletting, which were at best worthless and at worst fatal. October 11, One day, 119 died. This is in a town of 55,000 people now. Imagine Kalamazoo losing 100 lives a day. Gravediggers worked around the clock. No mourners dared come near. Wives fled husbands, parents from children, children from parents. An exciting Southern belle named Dolly Payne watched her father-in-law die, and then her mother, and then her husband died in her arms. Dolly almost died, but she lived to marry again a year later and go down in history as Dolly Madison. Ships lay at the docks, unloaded. All schools closed. Nobody to clean the filthy streets. Mid-September, there was no food. People were starving. No mail delivery. Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, was stricken. The federal government evaporated. Clerks refused to remain at their desks. The new federal city on the Potomac was being built. The Washington family remained in Virginia, away from the yellow fever. But the president had nobody to advise him. In September, more than 1,400 Philadelphians died. Then it was autumn, and the frosts came, and the mosquitoes died, and the plague began to taper off. Not all at once, but gradually the death rate went down. The only thing is, nobody was bothering to keep count anymore. For a long while, nobody realized that the disease was diminishing. But the city refused to return to life. Citizens had seen their loved ones perish in such numbers that a kindness of nature had dulled their senses to the cruel pain, leaving them too numbed to pick up their own lives again. Traffic remained paralyzed, houses shuttered, the waterfront deathly still. It was going to take some shock. It was going to take some startling thing to jolt the city awake again. If only the government would come back and reopen for business, instill some confidence in the people. But the scattered government was now mostly at Germantown, planning for Congress to meet there. And this left the stricken city of Philadelphia just barely alive and abandoned for dead. And then one man recognizing the need, elected himself to revive the city. And on the morning of November 11, there's a distant clatter of horses' hoofs in the silent stone streets of Philadelphia. Cowed fugitives from fear began to peer behind their drawn shades or open the door just a crack to see. And down there at the end of the street, a tall man on a great white horse is riding alone down the street, right down the middle of the street, bowing slightly toward any sign of life that he sees in the houses as he passes, and suddenly there is a stirring. There is a babble of voices, and then from somewhere a shout goes out, and windows are thrown up, and shutters are banged open. From outside the town, behind this lone horseman, refugees begin returning on foot. The gaunt gray or yellowed faces of those who had stayed behind came awake again. A whole city revived, returned to life behind the example of this tall man with a ruddy face and a fringe of once red hair. It was he they had followed before and would once more. Moving alone through the streets of silent death, George Washington brought the city back to life again. And now you know the rest of the story. You know, locked away inside each of us is a recollection of at least one very special holiday, right? Often a scene from childhood, as is this next. A fond Christmas memory of a winter long past. Charlie was 10, and school was out. Christmas vacation. Family would spend the holiday in the country. A light snow was falling. Charlie pressed his nose against the window glass. How unlike the big city where traffic blackened the white loveliness almost before it touched the street. But here all was quiet, cottony white. How would Charlie like to go out for a car ride in the snow, his mother asked, and Charlie would like that very much. So the boy and his mother got into the car and they drove off down the snow-laden lane. Even the tiniest little twigs on the barren trees glistened. Charlie wondered what made the ice cling like that. He listened to the squeaky crunch of the snow under the car tires, and the snow began falling more heavily. A mile or so down the road was a gentle curve. Mother knew it was there. She drove slowly, approaching it. I suppose It had to be a patch of ice which caused the automobile to slide off to the side into the shallow snowdrift. Anyway, Charlie thought it was fun. His mother's smile shifted into reverse, but no traction. The wheels were spinning. Mother is now no longer smiling. But Charlie didn't even wait to be asked. He opened the door, climbed out into the snow. He said, "I'll push." And he scampered around to the front of the car. But again, Mother stepped on the accelerator, and yet her son's effort to resist didn't help, at least not enough, and the automobile stayed there, stuck. But it was all right, Mother said. There was a house not far away. Strangers, and yet surely friendly. So hand in hand, young Charlie and his mother started walking. The snow's falling more heavily now. It seemed a very long way up the slippery lane, but at long last, in a vague silhouette against the gray-white sky, the big house loomed before them. Mother knocked on the door. Moments later, it was answered by a lady with a kindly face. And yes, of course, Charlie and his mother could come in, and yes, of course, they could use the telephone. The lady nodded in apparent concern as they related the details of their predicament. And it wasn't long before somebody came to rescue the adventurers, mother and son. It doesn't sound like a very special holiday, but it was. To us now, it doesn't sound particularly extraordinary. And yet, to Charlie's mother, and especially to young Charlie, it was an extraordinary occasion. For during that Christmas season of 1958, at Sandringham in England, a little boy of 10 learned what it was like to be ordinary. And that was really most remarkable in itself. For all of the pomp and the ceremony which has followed him since, there is that one halcyon scene from his childhood, that one adventure-filled afternoon meant only for him and his mother. And he'll never forget the look on the face of the kind lady at Anmer Hall when two visitors came to call, a mother and son seeking refuge from the snow. Elizabeth, the Queen of England, and little Charles, age 10, the heir to the throne. Now you know his favorite Christmas recollection, now that you know the rest of the story. Chicago, the Roaring '20s. That was the time and the territory of gangster Al Capone and of all of the Capone cronies, of all of the soldiers who served in that army of crime. Only one earned the nickname Artful Eddie. Eddie was the fast lawyer's fast lawyer. Through his loopholes walked the most glamorous rogues in the gallery of gangland. 1923, Eddie himself was indicted on an illegal booze deal, $200,000 worth. You know, he won his own reversal. And later, Al Capone picked up Eddie, and he put him in charge of dog tracks nationwide. You see, Eddie had already swiped the patent on the mechanical rabbit. And pretty soon, Artful Eddie, as the Capone Syndicate representative, became known as the undisputed czar of illegal dog racing. Nothing could have been easier to rig in favor of the mob. You got 8 dogs running, you overfeed 7 of them. It was as simple as that. And in no time, Artful Eddie became a wealthy man. And then one day, for no apparent reason, Eddie squealed on Capone. I said Eddie squealed on Capone. Said he wanted to go straight. Went to the authorities. He wanted to go straight, he said. What did they want to know? Well, the authorities were understandably skeptical. Why should Artful Eddie, the pride of the underworld, seek to undermine his own carefully constructed track empire? Didn't Eddie know what it meant? To rat on the mob? Oh, yes, he knew. Then what was the deal? What could he possibly hope to gain from aiding the government that he didn't already have? Eddie had money, Eddie had power, Eddie had the pledged security of the one and only Capone. What was the hitch? And that's when Artful Eddie revealed the hitch. There was only one thing, he explained, that really mattered to him. Only one thing. He had spent his life among the disreputable and the despicable. And after all was said and done, there was only one who deserved a break, and that was his son. So Eddie squealed. Oh yes, the mob remembered. And in a very short time, 2 shotgun blasts would silence him forever. So Eddie never lived to see his dream come true, but it did come true. For you see, as he cleansed the family name of the underworld stain, then his son became eligible for, became acceptable to, and was accepted by Annapolis. His son became the flying ace who downed 5 enemy bombers and went on to win our Congressional Medal of Honor. So the next time you fly into Chicago's O'Hare International Airport, you will remember with respect Butch O'Hare. But I hope you'll also remember his daddy, Edward J. Artful Eddie. For that airport is a shrine to a most uncommon filial love of a father for his son. Artful Eddie O'Hare is the crook who one day went mysteriously straight and paid with his own life for his son's chance to make good. And now you know the rest of the story. Good day.